Firstly, it must be reminded how everything created as through the body vehicles that are the generators of all we create, the creations of which we then add as though as files to a computer database, the consciousness, and experience effected then from these idea files of the consciousness into a simulation as made available, made viewable through the body vehicles. Body vehicles also effected from the consciousness. And how we have designed the consciousness, the agreement ideas it contains, that we have created and decided upon, or the created ideas of others we have uploaded and agreed with. The consciousness design will effect accordingly the body vehicles, the nature and form of them, the extent of their distortion, etc. But regardless of the body type thus effected, from the self-decided programming of the consciousness that generates them, they are designed to decode these ideas of the consciousness into a simulation, that we have our created, simulated experiences to recognize the true reality from the all is, comparing the everything real reality with that which isn't everything, which would be isolated parts, that through the mechanics of creation can we encapsulate, can we isolate, place in our consciousness engine room as ideas, and then experience the isolated encapsulation of them through the body vehicle idea decoding mechanics. Able to experience then pieces, parts, and to compare them to the everything isness as we move from the personal self position, that of idea generating and the maintaining of these isolated idea parts of the whole everything is, to the real awareness position, the nowness of it, aside from the ideas and consciousness of a creation. The real awareness that is a part of this everything isness, and then we learn to recognize the difference, to ultimately recognize the is. And so, every idea created is a vehicle by which we, awareness, can experience the affected simulation of, and on the real side, in regards to symbology, so when we find ourselves sat within vehicles, cars, etc., so this indicates we are sat within a certain idea, which can be beneficial or detrimental, life and awareness speaking, as many times the idea we are sat in, represented by cars, would be along the lines of attitudes, or perhaps one of the aspects of the created self, the astral, mental, etc. As Dwayne once shared an experience where he was sat in a red car, and determining this to represent in fact the astral part of his created self, the red indicating the emotional created idea of passion, the passion for the focus and drive he has, for the promoting of the is, and assisting the earth and all of creation. And so, sat in our vehicles on the real side, will there be additional indicators as to the nature of the idea we are embracing, and indeed, who may be sat with us in the car would be further illumination as to the idea, attitude, or aspect of the created self we are utilizing. If we are sat with the guides, this would suggest ideas that are life beneficial, as opposed to being sat in a car with a reptilian controller, say. For as the car represents an idea, then for two individuals to be sat in the same car represents a sharing of the idea the car represents. All car occupiers in agreement with whatever the nature of the idea happens to be, and the ideas, the intents of the guides, will differ greatly to those of the dark force reptilians. So it pays to be vigilant as to who we are sitting in vehicles with, and indeed who is behind the wheel, as this indicates who is extending agreement to whom. The driver of the car would indicate the creator of the idea that the car represents. As much as cars represent then the ideas, attitudes, etc., that we are sat within, embracing, limiting ourselves to, or maybe becoming more aware as we apply certain ideas that are life beneficial, so can other types of vehicles surely represent the same. Anything from trucks to bikes to a spacecraft. And then it follows that should we have the impressions as to these vehicles representing then ideas, and not just a means of transportation and creational point-to-point illusionary motion, then the nature of the vehicle must indicate additional detail as to the nature of the idea, attitude, or aspect of the created self we are embracing at that moment. For I would find myself on the real side on a boat, one designed for travelling narrow waterways, canals, etc., and as I drifted along the water, so would I realise how dilapidated the boat was, as though it was virtually on the verge of sinking. And indeed, as I momentarily stopped the boat at the side of the canal, so would a passer-by suggest that the boat be retired, that it had nearly served its purpose. This I would agree with, but for now would remain with this boat just a little longer. As I said, the impressions were such that this boat represented an embracing or utilizing of an idea, just as sitting in a car might, but that it was an idea that was life beneficial in some undisclosed to the personal self way. And indeed, the fact that a boat travels across the surface of the water indicating generally the boundary between creation below and the true reality, the is, above. So to be above the water represents a standing in the nowness of the real awareness that is a part of the is, and not an immersion into the personal self and creation that to be below the water would indicate. I would construe this then as a further indication of an idea that is life beneficial, and maybe if I was in a submarine, say, below the water, and the submarine represented an attitude, idea, or an intent. This may well represent an unbeneficial idea that is more personal self-related and creationally limiting. Everything idea-wise, regardless of its nature, if it is beneficial or not, awareness speaking, are still ideas, and we utilize ideas to provide a benefit and present the ease, but must recognize them for what they are: tools, vehicles, creations, and the idea is to get through all ideas of a creation, to not cling on to any of them and lock ourselves into a continuous, simulated unreality as effected from them. But while in creation we do, as I said, utilize certain ideas, attitudes, whatever is required for our process. And indeed, as this boat did seem somewhat deteriorating, threatening to sink at any moment, further indication that all created ideas, regardless of them, we would not seek to cling to remain attached to, or sitting within, for the idea will surely pull us down into a creation below the water surface. This idea representing a boat would eventually sink, and perhaps the individual reminding me that this particular idea had served nearly its purpose, that the boat should be retired soon, was a real guide. Interestingly, as night fell, I rather was sleeping in this boat, but rather wary that it might sink while I did so. So sleep was somewhat fragmentary, and if the boat sank with me on it, as I retained this idea, and it pulled me under while sleeping, might we say I was unconscious to this occurrence, literally caught napping? But then the boat was suddenly under siege by what seemed to be hordes of mutated children, and what seemed to be the case was this, that at the head of this boat was a door, and although sealed, the dazzling light behind it shone around the door frame, and it was this door the mutated children were trying to reach. My impressions were that this idea, this boat, was a reference to the ears that the light behind the closed door represented. And on the real side, we always see individuals as they are now, according to their consciousness of life choices and decisions, regardless of how they look on the physical, as their effects they have decided to generate have yet to catch up with them through the processing of a cause to effect ideas on the physical level, but instantly so, as everything in actuality is, on the real side. The dark forces in all their expressions will be revealed as distortion of body types in various ways, according to the dark force individual on the real side and their consciousness. And sometimes the dark forces are in the forms of children, for in such instances can the child form represent a lack of awareness, a stage of undevelopment. And indeed, my impressions, via the real awareness that is a part of all real awareness, that is then through all consciousness, all the ideas of it throughout creation, and the ideas, the intent, behind every body form that effects from consciousness, so can the real awareness make determinations of the intent of all in our presence, and the personal self has then additional information to what is visually occurring. And these were dark force beings, expressed as children due to their lack of awareness, and mutated children at that, as distorted consciousness begets distortion of body form. They were trying to reach the ear's door, and I was preventing them from doing so. Not so much that I was negating them access to the ears, as this is the purpose of all awareness, to recognize the ears that all real awareness is a part of, and we would be sharing the opportunity with all, therefore, regardless of decided life choices and intent inclinations. It was more that this represented a situation where the ears must be recognized, and no part of the created self, the vehicles, can be utilized to this end, other than as comparison. You can't think what it is, as it is a reality aside from anything created. No amount of literal application can afford is recognition. And it was as though here these dark force beings were embracing this particular idea that this boat represented by boarding it, but that they thought that through the idea, the literal reference it represented, that referenced the ears, but could never be the actuality of it, that they could access the ears, the door that led to it. And although visually it seemed I was preventing them, more so a representation that the references can never be the reality of what they reference, and to think that the ideas can in some way magically open the door to the ears, well, this was very apparently not so for these dark forces, as they would be denied. Not that anyone was denying them other than themselves, as really it's just this one overall real awareness playing simulated games with itself, as expressed through the individual consciousness, personal self units, and what is decided, others taking on the roles, positions, the resistance, etc., all that we have decided to experience, that plays out in a simulation, and sometimes we can find that we assume real side roles where we do take on a part, where in fact we are providing a representation for others to recognize, if they do but realize this. And whatever this idea was that these particular dark forces so wanted to embrace, to cling to, and own for themselves, it could only be a reference. All ideas are creationally based, and we must only utilize them, not get absorbed into them, for this particular idea was soon to sink beneath the water level into the psych realms of creation, to be retired as the guide suggested, and perchance replaced, maybe upgraded, enhanced, developed, refining references that pertain to the ears more so. The scene would switch, and now would I have impressions, though very little visually occurring at that moment, as though simulation not required, a more so influx of real awareness impressions that on such occasions have rather an absence of simulation, and yet just as much information can be received. The impressions were of two large groups. All were of the stepping up, becoming more aware persuasion, and all were creating in such ways that would be referencing the ears, and be as a beneficial assistance to all in this simulator. One group was more strictly environmentally orientated. This seemed their particular decided and agreed upon area of is representing and promoting, and indeed of projects that supported the environment that would allow for greater ease of existence on the physical. For to destroy the schoolroom that creation really is, a school for recognizing the is through, can't in any way make the process of is recognition any easier. And the other group was more so along the lines of working with frequencies, technologies that would still be environmentally beneficial and supporting, and it was this group that I was a part of, and of all the individuals that made up the group, only one would I recognize, that being another new friend, Dean Val. And although operating in their separate decided objectives as they were, each group maintained affiliation with each other and came into a conjunction with certain projects. Everything initiating from the real side, as all ideas, intent and agreement must. Everything instantly on the real side, as it is decided and agreed to, and then filtering through to the physical as it might, according to agreement that must be maintained to the ideas for this to be so, for whatever is taking place multi-dimensionally to become physical level manifest. And so this was an indication of the continued efforts of those agreeable with environmentally benefiting endeavors, and more so on a galactic scale, as these groups were large and consisted of various species and body types. As more individuals become involved and want to assist and earn their respective ways, etc. For indeed, the environmental projects, planetary or galactically, are a step towards the ease, yes, are somewhat essential to facilitate greater physical level longevity, that the planets are not destroyed or made uninhabitable, but then the idea being, the real purpose is to ultimately recognize the ease. And in regards to beneficial technology, frequencies, etc., really anything that can be used as a benefit or a detriment is that which has been decided through the consciousness. What we decide, agree with individually and collectively, affects the mirroring simulated experience. Really then, technology is very secondary, but if through the consciousness, so it has been decided that such and such is so, but only with this frequency, or that piece of tech, then it makes sense to utilize what has been decided, if it can indeed be of benefit. We can see then how individuals can become able to manifest or instantly effect creational alteration as they see fit. They learn to bypass the decided and agreed to laws of consciousness that dictate limitation, and recognize how in reality the simulation reflects what we decide, and so realistically this can be taken to its ultimate conclusion, and you have beings who can instantly on the physical create what they desire, unshackled from the consciousness where programmed agreements reside that may limit this ability. Interestingly, working with the frequency and tech-orientated group Val and I was a part of would be large numbers of very gifted and aware children also. Children being especially precious, as until they are indoctrinated and absorbed into the consciousness, they very much maintain their connection with their real awareness, and though they still must go through their process also of consciousness facing and the releasing of all the agreements and attachment tap lines it comprises of, they are far less shackled and creationally limited, as their focus is not locked in as yet one-dimensionally, and with their real awareness connections present, so should they step into their processes of awareness, can they make great leaps and bounds, as they don't have to extricate themselves from the encasement of the personal self. A personal self-consciousness they haven't yet been absorbed into, and then must struggle to see through the illusions of the created ideas it comprises of. As such, as they maintain a position aside from their consciousness, they are not as yet part of the agreement engine that is effecting the simulator according to the dark force's design, as all consciousness will be programmed according to dark force reptilian ideas, and stepping into that consciousness, an absorption into it, and one becomes an additional cog that maintains the controlled simulator matrix as the reptilians have designed it, and indeed is a contributory factor to simulator demise, as the consciousness is the simulator. And as a consciousness currently stands, it is so programmed with restricting ideas, controlling ideas that stifle awareness and enhance continuously states of unconsciousness, so this is reflected in the simulator, which goes through, as our simulator is, its deterioration cycles to its inevitable implosion. And so children can be very instrumental. They are far more multi-dimensional and represent almost as though a clean sheet of agreements yet to be extended, and the dark forces will seek to lock them down as quickly as possible, to absorb them into their created and managed consciousness of agreements to their control. And at this time there do seem to be many children who are especially aware, making their presence known, initially on the real side, as everything starts there, and as I said, so it was, that a large number of these aware children were assisting us with these tech, frequency, environmentally benefiting objectives, and each seemed especially adept and gifted with this particular field. And although through real awareness can anyone access anything idea-wise that has been created, that anything can be known, determined, and executed on the real side through a real awareness that is through all consciousness, that nothing technological is then beyond the real awareness, regardless of the personal self's abilities and knowledge, where creational tech and frequencies are concerned. Perhaps this scene more suggested that which will become so on the physical, where to operate through the consciousness as we do when we experience on the physical, so we are more so resigned to the limitations as decided through it, unless we do learn to become instant effect manifestors of simulation. And perhaps then these children have a particular developed consciousness, where through their decided construction of it, so are they adept where frequencies and tech is concerned, as every consciousness is constructed according to each respective individual, and this then may be indication of what is yet to come, physical level-wise. Interestingly, there would be a scene that followed where I was attending what seemed to be a meeting held between very influential and highly positioned dark force beings, all of various body types, some rather indescribable as far as my personal self-storehouse of references go, and they would be discussing much by way of dastardly schemes and controlling agendas on a simulator scale. My attendance was more so an infiltration, under a guise, an outward form, a form of one of these dark force beings that should have been present, but for whatever reason was absent. And so was there an opportunity to take on the appearance of the absent controller and get to potentially eavesdrop in on the conversation. Agreements shared bind individuals together. For if we agree to an idea that another has created, we share the simulation that effects from that idea with the individual, and so it is that individuals are intrinsically interconnected with each other through the agreements they share. Overall, we all share the ideas that effect into this particular simulator as to play in a particular simulator, so we must take on the ideas of it that become our consciousness, that effect then the body of vehicles which decode the ideas that make up this particular simulator and how it currently stands construction-wise into experience. And so these would be ideas shared with all others who also are participating in this particular simulator, which has then an effected arena that we all are present within, and it's just a case of what additional ideas we decide upon that affect our accessibility in regards to others, where in creation we are positioned, etc., in relation to them, but no position beyond the ability to reach, depending on what is decided through the consciousness as to how this must be so, the use of a spacecraft or whatever. And so this open, anyone is accessible arena is a so on the physical level and the life levels as effected from a consciousness. But the real side is such that individuals can seclude themselves with far greater ease, be somewhat isolated in areas that, should we want to engage with them, we rather need their agreement that we can do so. Agreement to the idea of our created self-vehicles that has it as though uploaded within their simulation of idea illusions that the awareness that we are can operate through. And yes, we can view anything creational through a real awareness that is through all consciousness, and can therefore show the personal self anything simulated that effects from any ideas of the overall consciousness. But to engage or interact with individuals who are personal self creationally only operating often is the case, we need locate the agreements that present doorways into the real side illusions they are immersed within. This is somewhat easy with the dark forces, for it has been their business to secure agreements to their control from all in the simulator, and as the idea agreed to then links the two together, the controller and the controlled, so this is a permanent open doorway that allows the dark force controller to always potentially infringe on the real side experience of the controlled, regardless of the isolation the individual has exacted for themselves. The illusions of simulation they are indulging in, but this works both ways. The door swings both ways. And although we are on a process of releasing these agreements of the consciousness, if indeed we are doing so, the controllers maintain their agreements with us, as though always holding an open door for us, that at any moment we can simply walk into any simulated situation the dark forces are effecting for themselves on the real side. The dark forces are more multi-dimensional than those they enslave, but absence of the connection with the real awareness that they still are limited and only can see so far, and so very easy can we trick them or conceal ourselves behind outward forms, that should they have had their real awareness connections established, standing in the nowness of it and receiving impressions, so could they have determined the ideas behind what is visually and surface presented, and realize they had an impostor in their midst. And so it was that through the open door of agreements all dark force beings will maintain with practically all in this simulator, through virtue of a consciousness clung to in its idea entirety, so could I walk into this meeting being held between these highly positioned and assorted body-type controllers, and their lack of awareness, their absence of real awareness connection and recognition, had my disguise the form of one of their number who had failed to attend, be undetected as the mimicry that it was. And really it is so that once again would the attending of such a meeting be unnecessary. The real awareness could simply have afforded impressions as to what took place, but then the simulation of it, of being in the presence of all these varied and rather indescribable body forms, would, and indeed did, stick more so in the personal self-memory on waking. Alas, I would hear nothing of what took place, and was somewhat dismayed, personal self-wise. However, and even though this, my personal self, wasn't shown, my impressions were that, disguising myself as one of their number, had me able to influence their decision-making to an extent, as each attending member had relatively equal status and standing, and each would be heard and their words taken on board. And it wasn't so much then important that I overhear what was discussed, but that through my disguise, so could I influence what was decided, and the ripples of this manifested into another scene. A scene where I would be accompanied by all the gifted children from the tech and frequency-orientated group I was a part of. We would be travelling through space in a craft or other, and at a certain point, as we entered a particular region of creation, so a group of very powerful and highly placed reptilians would materialize on our ship. Their creational, highly placed hierarchical status afforded as impressions via the real awareness, and indeed, due to what I had been able to influence through my adopting the form of one of the dark force controller beings in the meeting, so had this manifested as these highly placed group of reptilians, willing and eager to listen to what I and the children were now proposing, in whatever way the chain of events from the meeting to this scene had played out, that had these reptilians now agreeable, and very likely would not have been, or even approachable, had it not been for my infiltration, influencing, and manipulating of the dark force meeting of the previous scene. The exact nature of the agreement established between these reptilians and the group of children and I wasn't made apparent to my personal self, but along the lines and themes of beneficial with life and awareness ideas, and so we shall see what will come of this. For the more highly placed a reptilian or any body type controller is, the more they can swing agreement on a massive scale. As the higher positioned a controller is, so there are greater numbers of tiers of controllers beneath them that answer and are in agreement with their dictates, which filters through the tiers to those that are at the bottom and are the largest level or tier, the controlled and enslaved simulator masses, where what is dictated from the higher tiers, these highly placed controllers, through agreement maintained, becomes simulator experience for all.